For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Strat News Global. You're on our daily evening show, The Gist. I'm Nitin Gokhale. And joining me on The Gist this evening is Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary and a China specialist who has been watching China for more than 3 decades, and of course now a prolific author on books that show various aspects, various developments in China over the past 30, 40 years, and someone who watches China very closely. Welcome to this program, Vijay.
Thank you, Nitin.
So, the new year brings new developments, or just before the new year was ushered in China, we are now looking at a complete reversal of the earlier zero COVID policy. And it seems that infections have risen, but it also seems that China has opened up suddenly. What do you attribute this sudden change in policy, in your view? Why has this been done?
I don't think that the change in policy was done voluntarily. I think it was done because public dissatisfaction reached a point where the Chinese leadership began to believe that if they did not change policy, it might lead to a bigger movement against the Chinese Communist Party. It is quite obvious that when the party congress was held in October last year, there was no indication given by the leadership of any relaxation of the dynamic zero COVID policy. And yet, a month later, they abandoned all controls. And essentially, what we are seeing today in China is a situation where people are left very much to their own devices in dealing with this pandemic. There has been no plan B, and there has been no well-organized exit plan. It is, in one sense, a catastrophic collapse of policy. This is important because, in general, we have tended to attribute to the Chinese over the years a great deal of calculation and strategy in the making and changing of policy. And this has been reinforced by the sense that when there is a strong leader and when that leader has eliminated all opposition, that the policy is likely to be well thought out and sustainable. In fact, the developments in November and December last year have shown that, contrary to that expectation, a single leader and an autocratic or authoritarian system does not automatically mean that policy making is better than in countries which follow other political systems.
I think a very valid point, and it takes me back to your first article for Strat News Global, in which you had said, I think way back in 2020, in I think mid 2020, where you had said that how countries like India and China handle the response to COVID pandemic will determine which system is better. And I think for 2.5 years, the Chinese really tried hard to show that their system was better, but now it's turning out to be, a complete disaster, as you have elaborated right now. But does this mean that Xi Jinping has no answers? Had not, like you said, there was no plan B. But can this be so unplanned, and can this be I would say, thoughtless on part of the top leadership, that they didn't even think that this could happen? Or what's your sense? I mean, why does this U-turn seem hasty, of course, but also in a panic mode that this has been taken? Does it indicate that there is a lot of, I would say, subterranean sense of protest and subterranean sense of panic amongst the leadership because of the people's reaction? Or what is the trigger?
I think we in the outside world, that is the world outside China, have been so dazzled by their economic successes that we have all forgotten that while the economy has grown very substantially and it is a major economic power with a strong economic foundation. It is a politically brittle state. In other words, it is an economic giant in one sense, but a political pygmy in the other sense, because its political system has simply not evolved after 1949. It remains a one party authoritarian system and a system where ideology of communism or socialism is rapidly fading. What the COVID pandemic and the subsequent collapse of Chinese policy reminded us was of that political brittleness and the unpredictability that non-democratic or authoritarian regimes bring. What happens typically in a democracy is that when governments stumble or when policies fail, there are other alarm raising institutions, including the free media, the judiciary, parliament, and public opinion, which lead to course correction before a catastrophic policy failure occurs or a disaster occurs. In the case of China, these institutions have never existed. But what has made it worse is that in the era of Xi Jinping, even the limited amount of freedom of discussion, of speech, of expression within the Communist Party has been replaced by a directive from the top that whatever the Central Committee led by Xi Jinping says must be unquestioningly implemented by the rest of the country. And there is no scope for debate even within the highest echelons of the Communist Party. When such a system is put into place, people are hesitant to speak of the truth. In this particular case, you will remember that in February 2020, even the Chinese whistleblower was eventually silenced, and perhaps his death was caused by the relative neglect that was given to him, medically speaking, after he had dared to speak out about the pandemic. And that must have been a very sobering, that must have had a very sobering impact on the rest of the establishment, which might otherwise have been tempted to point out that things were not going too well. But nobody had the courage to tell Xi Jinping in November 2022 that there were now sufficient measures that the world had experimented with, including vaccinations and pandemic control, which would allow for a relaxation of policy and a return to a more normal way of life. And therefore, when this demonstration took place, nobody was ready with Plan B. Nobody had the courage to put into action a Plan B, which had earlier been approved by the state. And therefore, what you saw was a virtual collapse of policy. And at the moment, the very fact that the Chinese have stopped producing daily statistics and have removed all curbs, including RT-PCR tests, suggests that they do not want to have another policy because they fear that public opinion may not support anything they do. And therefore, there is a state of stasis. It is a paralytic state therein at the moment. Now, I have no doubt that the leadership and the senior echelons of the party must be looking at how to retrieve the situation. And we will see steps unfolding because, after all, this is a government with long experience in governance as well. But the fact is that the chinks in the armor have been exposed both to the people of China and to the outside world. And we must focus on this, and we need to study China's internal situation much more carefully, because this is the second incident in 30 years where there has been a catastrophic collapse in policy, the first being the Tiananmen incident of 1989. And what it should tell us is that although the Chinese state might appear very secure and firm from the outside, there is internally a situation which does not allow the state to behave like other normal states when there are serious challenges. And going forward, we might see an implosion again. And this time it may not be so controlled an implosion. And we need to be aware of that.
Indeed. In fact, the world will watch very carefully. And I think you've pointed out very succinctly, I would say, the fragility of the internal party machinery or the government machinery, which has no safety valve, so to say, where opinions are expressed. And that brings me to your the latest book that you have written
May I
about.
may I venture one other point, Nitin?
Please,
I am
please.
not as optimistic as you that the
Yeah.
world will actually draw lessons from this. Because when the COVID restrictions completely disappear and
Right.
a billion Chinese start traveling and trading and doing business abroad, this is still an $18 trillion economy, and the world tends to quickly forget the lessons of the zero COVID policy and its collapse and start looking at their material interests. I therefore I'm deeply skeptical whether the world will understand what happened in China in November, December 2022. We may be reminded of it when the next catastrophic policy collapse occurs. And therefore, I think through the medium of this interview, I do urge thinking Indians, while of course benefiting from the Chinese economy, to also remember that this is a very fragile polity and that we need to prepare for a time when the Communist Party may collapse or some of its policy may collapse with very serious implications for the rest of the world, including for us.
Oh, yes, indeed. Very valid caution for the right thinking Indians, and I think the Indian state itself. But you're right. I mean, the rest of the world, especially the Europeans and the Americans, will quickly forget, as we have seen what happened in Tiananmen after 1989, after the incident there. They all trooped back to engage with China and start doing business. So that will happen certainly. I mean, I'm as confident as you about that particular thing happening. But what I was coming to is the fragility of the state internally. And what does this mean for Xi Jinping, who is into his third term now, and his whole image, which the entire state was built on his image as a strong man, as somebody who's in full control and is there for life. Does this now challenge his position internally, or he's still very strong as far as the controls over the Chinese Communist Party or the government is concerned?
Nitin, information about what is happening inside the party, particularly at the higher levels, has always been a scarce commodity. And the world has resorted to guesstimates rather than any serious analysis based on fact. But we have to presume that since President Xi Jinping is very much in control of the security services and the military, there may be no immediate challenge to his position. On the other hand, having taken credit for what China achieved in pandemic control in 2021 and the earlier part of 2022, and having used this to eliminate his other rivals from political office, including Premier Li Keqiang and Executive Vice Premier Wang Yang, there must be some internal churn within the Communist Party of China about whether the leadership changes that happened in October 2022 are necessarily the right ones that happened. Now, this does not mean there will be a reversal, because that is not the way the Communist Party behaves. On the other hand, the declining influence of people like Li Keqiang and Wang Yang is not likely to remain as a declining factor. I have no doubt that these people will begin to speak up. They may not be in power, but they will still have influence within the party. They still have supporters within the party. They still, to some extent, enjoy factional support within the party, although President Xi Jinping has outlawed factions. And it is the dynamics of a large number of leaders within the party and the party members which can change politics, as we have seen in the 1980s, the 1990s, and even in the time just before President Xi Jinping took office. The challenge that was mounted by another Politburo member, Po Xilai, alarmed a sufficient number of former leaders and former office holders who came together with the existing office holders to effect change. And we cannot rule that out in the future. But if you were to ask me to make any definitive conclusion, I would simply say that it is unlikely that in the next 12 to 18 months, the president of China will face any serious problem which will challenge his authority. On the other hand, some mitigating actions that he might take might actually lead to some restoration of the lost authority. And therefore, what is critical at this point from his perspective and from China's perspective is what actions the government takes in this new year, in 2023, which will, in a sense, allow the people of China to forget the pandemic disaster that took place in November and December 2022.
Well, I think you put it absolutely correctly about what would happen to Xi Jinping. Nobody, I think, expects him to lose authority or lose control. But it's also about credibility, right? Internationally, Xi Jinping might be now seen as someone who can falter, who can stumble, and someone who can be put under pressure. So that could be another factor in diplomacy. Do you think the Americans are going to put pressure on China, or is it going to be business as usual between China and the US, which is the biggest rivalry right now, and not considering India, China at the moment, but just talking about the big two? What is your assessment on that front?
I have no doubt that there is a structural problem in the Sino US relationship, and that the structure that was erected by President Nixon and his successors has been seriously stressed and might be close to collapse. That having been said, these are two major powers, and they have interacted and maintained contact even in conditions of extreme stress in the 1950s or after the Tiananmen incident, and even during the COVID crisis. We have a new Chinese foreign minister who has just served as ambassador in Washington, and he too would have got some measure of the American leadership. The world also is highly interconnected. The economies of the two largest economies are highly interdependent. And therefore, I think what we are going to see is a decade of rivalry in those sectors where both countries believe they want to gain the edge over the other, coupled with a certain amount of collaboration where both of them feel that rivalry will damage their own economies or their own polities or have deleterious effects on their own people. So it's going to be a decade of uncertainty, as I said, and the biggest uncertainty is going to be Sino-US relations.
So, if that be so, how should India approach this decade or this year at least to begin with? Given that China is in a position where there are problems internally, there is this collapse of the COVID policy, and there could be effects on the supply chain because India has a huge bilateral trade and, of course, has a huge trade deficit with China. How should India look at this as a fallout on India-China relations?
Yeah, so I think there are two things we can say for certain. First is that despite assurances that we will disengage and de escalate on the line of actual control, Chinese actions, in fact, suggest the opposite. There has been an augmentation of the PLA regular forces along the line of actual control. And as we have recently seen in the Tawang sector, the escalating activities by the PLA have continued. And this is a fact we have to live with. The second fact is that we are going to enter this decade with a significant power asymmetry. Because although China's economy is slowing down and India's is picking up, the sheer momentum of an $18 trillion economy will mean that the gap between the two economies will still be substantial until the end of this decade or the beginning of the next decade. So we have to live with the power asymmetry, and our policies have to take that into account. Now, given this fact, I think, to my mind, there have to be a few things that we need to start thinking about. The first, of course, is to resume the regular dialogue. Ultimately, 3 years of no dialogue at a political level has not, to my mind, had any significant impact in terms of China backing away on the line of actual control. It is, of course, reasonable not to talk, but the risk in not talking is that the chances of a mishap are greater than when you are actually in communication with each other. So, the first thing is we need to look at a way to resume the discussion. The second point is that there has to be some amount of mitigation of risk of over dependency on the Chinese economy and in terms of supply chains. But that reduction in dependencies has to be on a sustainable basis. We must recognize, first of all, that some of our best performing sectors, pharmaceuticals, auto components, electronics, textiles, are highly dependent on Chinese intermediate products or capital goods. And therefore, a sudden break in terms of trade or boycott of products is a childish way of looking at things. We need to have a strategy in place not only to make in India, the Atmanirbhar Bharat policy, but also to diversify imports and supply chains, even if it were to be expensive or more expensive in the short term, so that we are able to develop alternate sources and reduce that dependency. And I believe government is thinking in this direction. But perhaps that entire process may need to be telescoped given the fact that the relationship between India and China is not at a great level. And thirdly, of course, we do need to maintain a certain degree of credibility and consistency in our statements with regard to China. That again is something we are seeing from the government. And that needs to be sustained over a period of time. And I believe that if we do talk tough as we are, then it is perfectly reasonable to resume dialogue, because dialogue by itself does not mean that we compromise on our principles or our basic positions. It only means that we message the other side more clearly so as to reduce the risk of mishap. So I would say that these are some of the issues that we should think about in the year 2023, and I have no doubt that these are issues that the government is already seized of.
I'm sure that is happening. It's on that point. It's a great recommendation. Those 3 points that you made about what India should look at, how India should look at China in the year 2023 and beyond, perhaps. But that's all something in the future. But for the moment, I think China is grappling with a crisis of proportions which they had never expected, perhaps when the zero COVID policy was initiated. So let us see how it pans out. But it has implications for the world and for India for sure. But for certainly the Asian continent, if not the world, really in the immediate months. But for this insight, I must thank you. As usual, very candid and very forthright and very insightful about what's happening in China. Thanks for this conversation, Vijay.
Thanks, Nitin.
Okay. Pleasure. So that was Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary, a China specialist. As all of you know, he's been a regular guest on our programs, giving us a glimpse into what is happening in China and what is his assessment about the fallout of the current turmoil that is happening within China and the implications for the world and India. That's all I have for this program right now. Do keep watching Strat News Global and keep sending us feedback and your comments. They're always welcome. You know where to reach us on social media. Do follow our handles. Our YouTube channel is there for you to subscribe. If you've already subscribed, get your friends, family, and acquaintances to subscribe and spread the word about our channel and the discussions that we have here. For the moment, it's goodbye.